If I said to you the phrase perfect vinyl forever, what would that mean to you? Well, other than being maybe the perfect phrase to slap on the front of a t-shirt, it's actually a company that specializes in, well, perfect vinyl forever. And the thing about it is, they not only provide a service that cleans your records, they will optimize and restore them for a vinyl experience that you have to hear to believe. And I have. But I'm going to avoid spoilers right here because I want this show, this episode, to speak for itself, because I've invited the owner of Perfect Vinyl Forever, Steve Evans, to talk about his service and also what it means to the vinyl community. I have with me here Steve Evans from Perfect Vinyl Forever. And with that, welcome to the show, Steve. And before we jump in, I would like you to what do you think folks should know about you and your service? And then I'll jump in on my experience.
So, thanks, Rick, for having me on your channel. It's an honor. I appreciate it. What should people know about Perfect Vinyl Forever? It's an anomaly in the hi-fi world and in the vinyl world. It is one of the rare instances where you can get the absolute best outcomes without having to have all the upfront costs to achieve the best outcomes. So if you were to try and replicate our record cleaning and optimization process at home, it would cost several $1,000s, probably close to $10,000 to get a close replication of what we do to optimize vinyl. However, because we deliver this as a service, the investments and the continuous process improvements we've done to extract more music and information off the surface or the groove of a record is available at a nominal service cost of $8 a record for our archival service. So I think that's like the launching point. There is an option. You don't have to buy equipment. You don't necessarily have to invest a significant amount of time per record to get outstanding outcomes from your vinyl playback experience.
And that's an excellent point, and that's what interested me when you first reached out to me, Steve, about your service, was the fact that there was a service that used, and we'll get into the weeds a little bit, but a service that uses ultrasonic cleaning and a very, I would say, scientific process to go through the cleaning steps and negate the need to have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy equipment from a user's perspective. So just to give the folks watching just a little bit of insight, Steve reached out to me a few months ago and we began a conversation about his service. Mm-hmm. So he provided me with some samples so I could hear what it does. And when I say samples, he sent a handful of records. There were 2 copies each of each record. One was a control that hadn't been cleaned, that hadn't gone through Steve's process, and one was a record that had gone through Steve's process. He even included some favorite records of mine, just so it was more enjoyable for me. That one was The Doors' "L.A. Woman" was one of them. "Toys in the Attic" by Aerosmith. There was "Kind of Blue" by Miles Davis. Stevie Ray Vaughan's "Couldn't Stand the Weather." So it was a great experience to sit down and listen to music I already loved. And one thing I will say, and listening to the control record and then the record that had gone through Steve's process was, and I told this to Steve, it was dead silence. And I don't like to compare that to, like, say, the sound of CDs, but with CDs there's no surface noise, there's no background noise. With vinyl, when there's no background noise, there's still something special about vinyl. And you still have that warmth, and you still have that, what I always call analog umami that comes with vinyl records and the vinyl record playback experience. But there was, like I said, dead silence. You get to the between tracks, there was nothing. And it was very, eerie is not the right word, but it wasn't something I was used to listening to records, and even the records that go through my cleaning process, which obviously isn't anything compared to what Perfect Vinyl Forever can provide. But I'm happy with my process. But these were wonderful. So, but the one thing that folks should hear is, Steve sent me these. So to really know how that process worked and what it could provide, I had to send Steve some of my records. I mean, it's one thing for Steve to send me records that he'd cleaned. I mean, I wasn't there to know how those records sounded before or after anything. So I needed a more personal experience. So Steve had me send him 16 of my records. And Steve knows this. He sensed it back when we first offered to do that. I was a little hesitant to let my records go.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never left my records have always been in my possession. So I had a hard time boxing 16 records up that I love and sending them to Steve. And one of the records is the oldest, not the oldest record in my collection physically, but the first record I think that I ever was given. It was a Christmas present for my parents back in 1977. It was Elvis's In Person at the International Hotel. The thing with that record is it's gone through a lot of turntables, especially turntables when I was 10 years, 11 years old. So that record's gone through hell. So I was not expecting a miracle. But one of the services that Steve provides is called disaster recovery. I'm saying that right, correct, Steve?
Right.
That disaster
Correct.
recovery process.
Yep.
The other records, no. Some of them were a mix of sounding really good. Some had some surface noise. This record was in bad shape. And I wasn't expecting a miracle, but I was curious to know what the disaster recovery process might do. So I picked a mix, like I said, a mix of things, sent them off to Steve. They came back. I think within the first week I had played all 16 because I was very eager to hear these. The records that were in good shape, I did hear that dead silence between tracks that I had experienced when Steve sent me his first grouping of the control records and the ones that went through his process. I heard the same thing on the records that were in good shape or decent shape when I sent them to Steve of those 16. There were a great example of this was Layla, Derek and the Dominoes' Layla, 2-record set. I've had that record in my possession for maybe 30 years now, probably a little bit longer. It always had some surface noise, not bad, but nothing I could do with my cleaning processes over the years, and I've done it many times with that record, never quite cleaned it. There was always some surface noise. When it came back, I won't say it was dead silent, but it was just as good as new listening to it. It was the first time I experienced that record with that clarity. Now, I will say, now let's talk about the Elvis record when it came back. There was still pops and clicks. There was still surface noise. I expected that. There's no way that Steve can perform a miracle on a record. But I did tell Steve when I listened to the record, yes, there was still surface noise. It was hard for me to judge if it had been reduced, but what I did hear was a more depth in the music, a little bit more clarity below that surface noise. And I think I told Steve I heard the bass was more pronounced. So while there was definitely groove damage to that record caused by me over the last 40 years, there was an improvement with the disaster recovery process that Steve put it through. So I was very pleased. That was a really good test, and I was very pleased with that. Again, I don't want to tell anybody something that didn't occur. Did not completely remove anything, but it did improve the record, the listening experience of that record.
What you talk about the record being dead silent during the transition between songs, most people describe that as the music or the record having a blacker background. And that is kind of eerie because usually there's this anchor of very low noise rumble, friction between the stylus and the surface of the record that has, very low, static or just, a light rumble to it, right? And when you remove or improve that, it gets eerie because where's this music coming from? Suddenly you can't necessarily pinpoint that it's coming from a record. Until you hear the music and the way it's presented, then it has the analog attributes that people like you and I are attracted to the playback experience of a record. Regarding the demo records we sent, when I create my demo record library, I buy 2 copies at the very same time. So likely those 2 records, the A and the B, or the control and then the optimized, they likely came off the press at the very same time. So we try to make that as consistent of a comparison as you possibly can with media that has the amount of variability to it like vinyl does. So what you heard wasn't trickery, it truly was the outcomes of our
Right.
process. Um,
Yeah, and that was, and you proved to that when you sent my records back to me. So, yeah, any doubt I might have had, or any skepticism, not that I really had any, but any that I did have was erased.
So with your records, the experience you have is what we recommend most first-time users to our service do for themselves. They say, well, which record should I send to you? And it's pretty straightforward. I say, send me 4 records that need some help. That would be Elvis, right? And that's where you're going to learn once you then have a listening session with those 4 records, the limitations of our service, because there's absolutely limitations. This is science, it's not magic. So even though sometimes the results can be somewhat magical, or the listening experience can be magical, it's really just founded in science and process. So there's limitations to both. From there, send us 4 records you couldn't imagine sounding better, whether they're new or vintage records, because that's where you're going to start to learn that there is more musical information in the groove of every single record that's been pressed since 1950. And that is helpful because now you're going to start hearing validation of our claims that we actually take an as pressed record and make it a higher resolution source for your stylus and your cartridge and your phono amplifier and speakers. Also, then for the remaining 8 records in the 16 record order, which is our minimum quantity, send us 8 records where the music itself connects with you very
Hmm.
immediately and deeply. Things that are really familiar. Because what I want you to experience as a first time listener of our optimized records is, how does this very familiar music, what are you learning about it that you didn't observe before in past listens? What's coming forward that you
Hmm.
didn't perceive previously? And sometimes it's hard to describe it because you're trying to describe something that's not there anymore. So you take
Right.
away that low level that noise floor, you take that away. So how do you describe that all the musics have now their own space in the soundstage, that the transients are more lifelike, that the decay is more natural, that you've never heard cymbals or snares or a female voice in the same way? To do that with music that you know very, very well, and I think Layla was a good example for your experience, really starts to hone in on the value proposition that we deliver. So when you talked about your experience, especially with Elvis, I call that first order or first level observations, right? Pops and clicks, are you removing those? And are you removing or lowering the noise floor? And do you have a blacker background? Um, that's everybody, every new listener goes through that because it's easy to quantify. It's easy to kind of turn off that analytical side of your brain saying, okay, yeah, that process actually worked. But how about for some of the more challenging claims that Mr. PVF tends to make on conversations like this? High resolution vinyl, is this guy legitimate or not? Well, that's where lifting your focus point as you listen tends to bring forth those new revelations from the music or from the record. And then you can keep on going up the hierarchy of listening, as I call it, and then get a more deeper and more satisfying experience as you focus on listening to your music. Which ties back to the reason I specifically reached out to you, Rick. As I watched the content on your channel, like like everybody else, there are the objects that we talk about, the vinyl records themselves, the equipment, whether it's the cables or the preamps, amplifiers, the tubes themselves, speakers. There are the objects. But Rick, what I was drawn to and why I thought this would be a good fit is because you always then tie it back to the experience. the experience of being moved by the music you love. And that's what we aim for. Pops, clicks, lower surface noise, darker backgrounds, absolutely. That's a given. But then how do we actually elevate the art of listening to music from vinyl? That's the stuff that people have to hear to believe.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it. Just it's that engagement with the experience. And you said something a little earlier that I do want to touch on in just a moment about the about pulling more information out of the groove, um, even on records that have gone back, go back to the 50s, 60s,
Mhm.
that the equipment and the processes back then could not reach. And I do want to talk a little bit about that and how your process allows that to happen. Before we jump to that, and I want to ask, what got you into doing this? I mean, like you said, this is a very expensive setup that you have. Um, what started it?
I well, so I started my hi-fi journey with limited funds. Therefore, I started it from a position of DIY, whether it was to take a vintage component, and I'm fairly handling with a soldering, very handy with a soldering iron. And while I can't design circuitry, I certainly can swap components, match, upgrade, etc. So I would find uh, I would call them like internet darling components that have like a lot of upgrade improvements that you can readily find on forums. And I would start fixing and improving vintage equipment. And then I get to the point where I needed a record cleaning machine because I was a vinyl, I preferred vinyl as a musical source, even though my playback system wasn't terrific at the time. And I started looking into it. My career background is in automation. So I've have this process mentality, this automation mentality, combining everything from chemistry to physics to electronics to, um, you name it. It all kind of gets wrapped into the automation industry. So I was looking at a VPI, vacuum-based record cleaning machine. Like $500. I don't have $500 for a record cleaning machine. So I was going to build my own. I was going to take a shop vac and make my own wands and things of that nature. Then I was going to automate it. One button, boom, 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 and then I get one side of a record that has been cleaned. Then I started looking more into ultrasonic. Now this is back in like 2015, 2016. And ultrasonic cleaning was out there, but there wasn't a lot of refinement to it. It was a lot of DIY, a few pretty expensive machines that I couldn't consider. And I started looking more into it. I'm like, I think this is the right way to go. But every avenue I went down, there always seemed to be a compromise. So I decided I'm going to eliminate the compromises by building the ideal process. And because I'm able to build one single machine and do whatever I need to do to get the best outcomes from it, plus I needed to factor in having some level of throughput because at the time I had a whopping like 1,000 records. And Rick, I was like, how am I going to clean all these records, right?
I know that feeling, Steve. Every time I land on something that works or makes things sound better, I want to put everything through that process.
Absolutely. So I started looking into how could I do a couple records at a time, and then how many records could I do at a time. Then I got the idea. Well, if I'm going to build this machine, because now my mental image of this machine was far less practical than a machine that I could potentially buy. Like maybe if I started a service, I could start offsetting some of these investments that I'm going to make in the machine. And I did that. And with the partnership of a close friend who owns a hi-fi shop here in my local Milwaukee, Wisconsin market, um, he was like my mentor, kind of guided me as far as the sonic qualities of the outcomes, not just necessarily the pops clicks reduction. Um, Ultimately, we came out with my base level process, and that was 2017 is when we started offering this as a service. From there, I'm addicted to continuous improvement. So, we started at a certain spot. We had great outcomes because I was able to do ultrasonic cleaning, ultrasonic rinsing, and a better drying process than the machines that were out there at the time, started to build up a clientele, which then allowed me to reinvest and think of, okay, if I'm here, is there more to achieve? And then I would do things like upgrade my ultrasonics, change my frequencies, and then run that as our archival 2.0 process. Okay, great. A couple years go by, a few more ideas come to the surface, a lot of observations, and that's really where continuous improvement comes from. I have the fortunate position of being able to clean hundreds of records for people every single week. And from there, not only am I observing the outcomes, but I'm getting many other ears and minds that are observing the outcomes and providing feedback. So anyhow, here we are, Archival 4.1 SMF. It's our fourth iteration in 8 years of doing this as a service. And yeah, it's been great. So long answer to your short question. That's how I got into this mess. And yeah, it's certainly a passion of mine. And
Yeah.
again, I'm driven because I like the outcomes. This ultimately feeds my addiction of listening to music sourced from vinyl.
Right. Yeah, well said. Yeah, and we should probably also add that this is a global service. I mean, you have customers, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in Japan and such. Or...
Right. We do serve clients outside of the United States. Happily do so. There's one practical barrier that we need to work through, and that is the additional shipping cost.
Right.
We offer a couple things, a couple of special process changes for our international clients from the United States perspective international, to help reduce the impact of the shipping cost. But yes, I've got people in APAC, South Africa, Hungary, Europe that frequently send me records. And even when you add on the additional costs for shipping, they still find that the value proposition is very strong. Therefore, they continue to send in records, order after order after order.
Yeah. So, let's talk a bit about, you mentioned that, in your journey and cleaning records and creating your own vacuum and such, and then you hit on ultrasonic, I think around 2015-ish, 2017. You're like, ultrasonic seems to be the way to go. And you decided to do it yourself and build your own and get to the point where, you were able to offer this service and iterate upon the service and improve it and iterate upon the process, I should say, and improve the process. All in getting that extra information, or the goal of getting that extra information out of the groove. So what it makes yours different, or how have you improved upon, say, some of the other solutions that are out there? And what do you see in ultrasonic that makes it the better solution?
Oh, excellent question. So to start this explanation, I think we need to define the problem, if you will, or the hypothesis of what we want to impact. And that gets into a point of differentiation that people are starting now to understand when I talk through the difference between cleaning and optimization. Okay, cleaning is the sanitization of a record, meaning you're getting things off of the surface of the record that should not be there, things that ultimately impede your listening experience. Optimization is pulling more data, more information, more music information out of the groove. Well, for that to be a reality, something that you can hear on your own records, on your own system, there has to be more music to be found, and there is. So the premise is, beneath every record that's been pressed since 1950, there exists a groove profile that is much closer to the groove profile that was carved in the lacquer by the mastering lathe, that ultimately gets obscured somehow in the manufacturing of the record. So you go from the lacquer to plating to pressing the record and then packaging and shipping it out. Well, what's happening is if you think about the core polymer, it's PVC. Well, most of us don't think of a thin, flexible disc as being PVC. We think of PVC pipes that you see in Home Depot and part of your plumbing in your home. That's
Right.
much closer to what the core polymer of PVC is like. It's hard, fragile, not easily molded. So to make it suitable for pressing records with its sub-micron, I want to stress that, sub-micron details, that a stylus or a cartridge is capable of retrieving, they need to add plasticizers to soften that. Now you have a
Okay.
compound material. And whenever you have a compound material, the bonds of the core polymer and the bonds of the additives are different. Core polymer is stronger, the additives, the bonds are weaker. So then when you press any material, but specifically something as soft as plasticized PVC, the tons of pressure and the hundreds of degrees of heat, as it's pressing the information from the stamper into the vinyl, causes the additives to separate, migrate to the surface, and stay there once the record is cooled and then released from the stamper. So you have what I call this manufacturing residue. It used to be called mold release. It does facilitate in the releasing of the molds, but technically speaking, a mold release is something that you would spray on the mold or the stamper, and that doesn't happen as we manufacture records. You have this manufacturing residue, and if you can carefully remove it, you will find additional details in the groove. So the manufacturing residue, which is like oils and waxes, actually act as an infill to the groove, both in the bottom and then along the sides of the record. And the better you can remove it carefully so you're not damaging the base groove beneath it, that's where you start getting more resolution, therefore a higher resolution vinyl playback experience.
Yeah, and you kind of answered the question I was just going to ask about that, that residue that you mentioned. Is ultrasonic the most effective way to get at that?
It is essentially today the only way to get and safely remove it. And cavitation, which is the actual process we're using, it's generated by ultrasonic frequencies. So cavitation is where you take vibrations into a fluid, into a bath, and those vibrations go back and forth to the point where it transforms the fluid into a gas in very tiny, small, microscopic bubbles. Once those bubbles get to a critical mass, they don't explode, but what they do is they implode, and then they send out a jet that gets to the surface of the record, and it's that jet hitting the surface of the record that actually has all the energy that's taking both surface contaminants and, when properly applied, the manufacturing residue off of the surface of the record. So you asked previously, so why do we get different results than the ultrasonic cavitation machines that you can buy from a variety of different sources? Because we're not restrained. I have one machine, and I can, because I design and built every facet of the machine, when I have a new theory to test, I can modify a machine and then do a bunch of in-depth listening tests to see if I'm getting better results. And that has led me to where we are with our archival 4.1 SMF process. It's a mouthful. You shouldn't let an engineering mind do marketing. but what that
Yeah,
means is
right.
archival has always been our premium service. It's always been the service that
Yeah.
gave the best results, specifically sonic results. 4 means that there have been 4 primary improvements of my archival process since 2017. And the .1 means if I'm making small tweaks, I track that with the tenths place of the version.
Gotcha.
Before I increase the single digit in front of the decimal point, there's one very specific criteria. If I take a record that was done previously, like with Archival 3.2, which was my latest release, and then clean it once again or optimize it once again with 4. The new 4.1 process, if I can hear a significant improvement in the audio presentation of the music, then it gets the significant digit goes up one. So that's, so for previous customers, they go back to their library and they may have a PVF record that was 2.0. And they thought,
Yeah.
well, I could probably get even better experiences from this record if I have it re-cleaned with 4.1. So the SMF part of
That's
4.1
interesting.
gets into the science of cavitation. Now I mean, we could probably have a separate conversation on that, Rick, but I'll touch on some of the principles. SMF stands for sequential multi-frequency cavitation. What I do in my machine is I have a dedicated 80 kilohertz, 135 kilohertz, and 220 kilohertz in my cleaning tank, meaning in the tank that has surfactants in it. And as you rotate the record through those different frequencies, you get the benefits of each frequency, each cavitation-induced frequency, without the limitations. The example I often use that people can relate to is think of if you've got a board and you need to sand it because you're going to paint or stain or varnish it. If depending on the condition of the board, one grit of sandpaper isn't necessarily going to give you the best results. So 80
Right.
kilohertz or 80 grit is good for kind of doing a rough surface removal. So you get the board, kind of flat and ready for the next step, which in my case would be 135 kilohertz. And that's a finer grit sandpaper. So you get a better finish. And then finally, 220 kilohertz, that's that really fine sandpaper that gives you that great finish on the very top of the board. And now you're ready for painting or varnishing. Kind of the same thing with records. So 80 kilohertz is good at it's good at the cleaning part of a record optimization process. The bubble that it forms is enough to get into the top of the groove and on the table between the grooves, and it has enough force to remove, dust, dirt, embedded particulates, etc. 135 is a small enough bubble that actually gets onto the surface of the groove itself. So that's really effective at removing the manufacturing waxes and oils. But then, then 220 kilohertz, that gets into the details of the groove even further. And that's how we really start to extract and reveal more information off the surface of the record.
Now, is that part of the disaster recovery process, or does that entail more steps?
That's another great question. Disaster recovery so archival is designed as its primary function to enhance the resolution of a record. Disaster recovery is a pre-treatment step that is designed to minimize surface noise from vintage records. And what we do is we will use a component that not many record cleaning processes use today, whether it's home or otherwise, and that is the component of time, meaning soaking records. If you look at what we use to rack the records, I can grab an example here. When we start by cleaning records, we put them into our carrier, okay? And this way it allows us to go from step to step to step effectively and safely. You'll notice that the carrier covers the labels themselves. And the way we can safely soak records for up to 12 hours is each one of the components of our carrier has a O-ring on it. And that sits right outside of the label on the dead wax. So with disaster recovery, we soak the records in a recirculating bath of detergents for up to 12 hours. And what that does is that gives it time, the solution, to get into the groove of the record and soften any organic materials that are on the surface of the record. Then we ultrasonically cavitate, pre-clean it with 40 kilohertz and 80 kilohertz. So when we do go into a deep dive about ultrasonic cavitation and the frequencies that generate cavitation, on any given moment, I can use 40, 80, 135, or 220 for experimentation or for incorporation into my overall process. And what I do with the disaster recovery step with a 40, 80 multi-frequency dedicated tank for disaster recovery is once those softened materials, those need to come out of the groove. And 40 and 80 kilohertz are really effective at removing those contaminants and making the record as quiet as possible to the point where any surface noise that still it remains is almost always going to be surface damage.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for explaining that. And you did mention different cavitation processes and stuff, and I do want to probably dedicate an entirely new episode just to talk about that, the science of cavitation, and to get your thoughts on that, because I'm sure,
Sure.
I know I'm very interested in that, and I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that would love to learn more about it. And something else, and I don't remember if this was a conversation we had offline, but you mentioned that this optimization process is when you optimize the playback experience, it becomes and I think the way you put it was a high resolution analog source. You go from an as pressed record to a high resolution source. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. It's tough to believe, to be honest. And I struggle when I started making that claim. To be candid with you and your audience, I struggle because I do everything I can to avoid hyperbole. There's so much hyperbole and misrepresented scientific principles, especially when it comes to the cleaning of records, that I don't want to be part of that echo chamber. I want to have a different perspective. However, I contend, because when I say high resolution vinyl, understand something about my business is that for my business to thrive, I need repeat clientele. So I'm not looking to clean just 16 records. I'm hoping that for the majority of people who send me their records, they are so thrilled with the outcomes that they almost have to send me another 16, 32, or 64 records. Um,
Right. Yeah.
so I need to be very intentional on the expectations that I set, because even if I set too high of an expectation, even if I deliver to 80% of that, I haven't earned the right to do more business with that client. So higher resolution vinyl, as I'd mentioned, if anyone who has heard a carved lacquer straight from a lathe, the experience of listening to that on your vinyl playback rig is very different. The grain of a lacquer is, I think, much smaller than the grain of a pressed vinyl record. Um, there is no infill whatsoever. You talk about a PVF record being eerie, Rick. Man, listening to a lacquer is unbelievably eerie, um, because it's so lifelike. It truly is amazing. So the data is there, the information is there, the greater resolution is there. In the very same way that you take a 1644 digital file and compare it to a 2496 digital file, there's just more information there. And the funny thing is, and again, people have a hard time believing it until they hear it, all that information exists on records that were started to be pressed in vinyl back in 1950s. But
Yeah,
something
that's amazing.
interesting uh, on that same topic is the difference between a vintage or an original pressing and reissues. And Rick, I get your newsletter and I watch your content, and you've been kind of going around and around on should you focus on vintage or is is there something to these reissues? And I
Yeah, all
contend
the
something
time.
that I contend there's things that people haven't thought about. The formulation of vinyl is drastically different through each decade that it was pressed. And today's vinyl is very, very different from the vinyl in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Basically, they had a lot of the compounds were hazardous and they ultimately outlawed their use, which isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing, right? Um, but as you come up with new formulations, it changes a lot. And I contend this, Rick. If you take a really good vintage pressing, it's in very good condition, and then you take a quality reissue, in my opinion, 9 times out of 10, the original has more life, is more dynamic, is more exciting, better space around the instruments. However, I think that's happening because despite the better mastering equipment we might have and the pressing equipment and process that has improved over time, the vinyl formulation has changed. And I think what's happening is they're adding more and different plasticizers to press records today. And I think that that leaves a heavier film on top of the record, which obscures
Uh,
more information. And here's how I correlate that theory. When I clean and listen to a UHQR, an Analog Productions UHQR record, to me, out of the box, it sounds a little dull, lifelike, and out of focus. But after I've optimized it and taken off the excessive plasticizers, which is necessary to make the record today, now you compare it to an original pressing, and the sonic characteristics are significantly closer to a vintage
wow.
record. So when people talk about, I've got this original pressing, you see this content all across all across YouTube. It's good stuff. I like it. But I've got the original pressing. I've got this lo-fi, or I've got this Analog Productions or Impex or some other really quality pressing, and they do a
Yeah.
comparison. They're not
Yeah.
comparing what lies beneath on the groove. They're only listening to what's on the surface of the groove. So there's a whole nother dimension to it.
Yeah, it really is. I do go back and forth constantly,
Mhm.
and my opinions change over time with the more I learn and the more experience. So I'm sure they'll change yet again. And you kind of hit on something too. If you when you talk about the UHQR and the first time you hear it, right out of the package and listen to it, it might be a little bit dull, maybe a little bit lifeless. And I've heard folks refer to that before. Now, should people clean their records as soon as they get them?
Mm.
Obviously, not everybody has a machine to do so. Some people do. Some people
Mhm.
have the record, vacuum machines like I do. Some people have, an ultrasonic that they might have purchased. That's consumer grade purchase that's out there. So what are your thoughts on that?
This might be paradoxical because I'm in the business to professionally clean and optimize records for people, but I'll be the first one to say you don't need to clean your records. I will actually take that further. You shouldn't clean your records at home. Now, let me add some context to that. You shouldn't clean your records at home until you have a minimally viable process. And that's going to include probably some equipment investment. Um, my golden rule is you should not wet clean a record unless you have a way to physically extract the cleaning fluids from the record and you incorporate a really well designed and effective rinsing process. You will do
Okay.
far more harm to a record by leaving cleaning residue on it than any gains you could potentially have cleaning the record going forward. So if you don't get to the minimally viable process, just just use our long trusty friend. Use a really good carbon fiber brush. Okay. This is a really nice one. They come in a variety of sizes, variety of styles, starting at $10. Just get the surface dust off your records and listen and enjoy the music as it is. Don't go the next step, which most people have done, and you and I have talked about this. We're guilty
Yeah.
of disc washing our records to death. Don't
Yep.
don't use a surface cleaner and a brush that dries on the record as the totality of the process. I strongly, if there's one takeaway from this conversation, record lovers, please don't do that. You're doing yourselves no favors. 9 times out of 10, the contaminant is being wetted and then pushed down further into the groove, and then it dries, hardens, and it's almost impossible to remove. So what does a minimally viable process look like? I would start with a vacuum-based record cleaning machine and then have a cleaning solution, distilled water for rinsing solution, and put 3 times the amount of time and effort in your rinsing step than your cleaning step. If you can get to that
Perfect.
point, I think you're going to reduce the amount of contaminants that are on the surface of the record without negatively impacting the longevity and the quality of the surface of the groove of the record. From there, you can consider adding in ultrasonic treatments along the way, as you've recently done with the Humming Guru. They all bring some form of benefit once you've got that ideal minimally viable process in place.
Perfect. Now, this isn't the only service that you provide, correct? Don't you also
Correct.
provide record flattening service?
Yeah, right. So we have essentially 3 different services. We have our archival service, which is
Yeah.
our base service. That is the sonic optimization of records, and we also happen to get them clean as a byproduct as well. For records, as we mentioned, are disaster for records that are vintage and may have
Hmm.
had some of those built-up cleaning solutions, some embedded dust, dirt, grime, fingerprints, etc., and you now have distracting surface noise with the record. There is an add-on service, Disaster Recovery 2.0 FMF, that can be applied to a single record in one of our PVF by mail packages, or all the way up to all the records in in your order. But
Okay.
it's not a standalone product. It has to be part of an archival package. Same thing for our flattening services. Now, folks, I do apologize because I get these questions all the time. I only have 2 records. I really just want flattened. Can you take care of them for me? Unfortunately, based on our workflows and based on the fact that we have to clean a record before we flatten it, otherwise, as you're softening the vinyl, you can embed surface contaminants into the record. We can't offer flattening as its own service. It has to be an add-on to an archival package. But we have 4 orb record flatteners, which are absolutely fantastic. We will improve almost all reasonable warps on a record, whether they're dish warps or whether they're edge warps. And you can do it on one record all the way up to every record in your archival order.
Oh, interesting. Oh, that's good to know. So what's the process like? So if somebody out there is, hopefully is listening right now and says, I want to try this out, what is the process?
Sure, it's actually straightforward because another value outcome that we offer is convenience. Now, Rick, you did mention separation anxiety. I totally get it. I totally get it. I
Yeah.
would be in the exact same situation should I have not started this company. But if you look on our website, you will see that we have a custom designed mailer. That mailer has 1 inch of protective foam on all 6 interior sides of our mailer. And you saw that, I think, when
Yep,
you
I did.
when you received our mailer, you're like, holy cow, this guy might be a little bit OCD over these types of things, and I
And it
am
was much
100%.
appreciated. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So when you place an order on our website, you can choose from packages that start at 16 records, but then we also offer 32 and 64 record cleaning packages. In addition to that, for each one of those sizes, we offer both a 6 and a 12 refresh subscription, which is the height of convenience. When you place an order, we will ship to you our mailer, and inside the mailer, it will have all the inner sleeves you need to simply take your record, put it in our inner sleeve, and then put it between the record protectors that we send, box it up, use the tape strips we provide and the prepaid mailing label, hand it to the appropriate delivery service, postal worker, and it comes to us within 5 days, 5 business days. We will turn the order around and then ship it back to you. Now, if your order includes flattening or disaster recovery services, that can extend our turnaround time a little bit, but we try to keep that, constrained as much as possible. So it's pretty straightforward to use our services. When you place an order for archival, 1632 or 64 record package, then you can add on either disaster recovery for one to all or flattening for one to all. And then when you send your records to us, please just put a little post-it note on the sleeve of the record that you would like to have DR pretreatment or flattening applied.
Yeah, and I will say too, you mentioned being OCD about the packaging. It was well done. It made me feel a lot better sending those out. I had, once I saw it and put it all together, it's like, okay, these records are safe. And I think you also mentioned to me too at the time, because of my reservations of letting records go, that you haven't had issues with shipping and such to date, correct?
That's correct, with one exception. So just put in perspective volume, I've shipped thousands of packages, thousands and thousands of records. I think we're closing in on 200,000 records optimized in
Wow.
the 8 years that we've been in business. Of that track record, I've never had a record damaged in our mailer due to impact or, for our friends in the desert Southwest, due to heat exposure.
Yeah.
That 1 inch of foam really does insulate and protect the records very thoroughly. Zero incidences over all those. Now, as far as delivery service, I've only had one PVF package not reach its destination. And what spoiled my perfect record there was some challenged person decided to ship liquid mercury through the USPS Postal Service.
Oh boy.
And that broke in a distribution facility, which happened to be right by a PVF package. And unfortunately, the mercury made that contaminated waste, and they had to destroy the package. So, of course, we felt horrible for our client. We refunded all our service fees. There was shipping insurance, which when you check out, you can select different levels of shipping insurance and different carriers, UPS, USPS, FedEx, different shipping levels of service. And so he had insurance on his. I refunded his fees. He got the insurance payout, and ultimately it was still that one time still bothers me, but ultimately it ended up pretty good.
I'm sure, and out of 200,000 records, that's impressive. That's very impressive. And for everybody watching, I will have links in the description, to Perfect Vinyl Forever, to Steve's service. And I'm also going to reiterate, what Steve had said, for your first order has, and correct me if I get this wrong, Steve, you get the 4 records that need some help, 4 records that you couldn't imagine would benefit from the service, and then 8 that you're just familiar with, that you're very intimate with, you know the sound, and so that when you do get these back, you'll know or hear that difference in playback.
Absolutely. So, for instance, in my demo records, I have, how do I say this delicately? I have titles that are well known by audiophiles. I'll put it that way. For instance, I think I sent you my kind of UHQR 33 RPM kind of blue.
Yes.
If you like jazz, you almost everybody knows kind of blue
Right.
inside and out. I chose such a familiar title because if it's so familiar based on ways that you normally consume that record, what can you learn from this if you've listened to this record hundreds of times over across different decades? Almost always people come back and say, I never heard this element or had this experience or heard this production technique in the background or the studio technique or the space of the studio suddenly became really apparent in my listening room. That's the type of stuff that we're shooting for. That's our primary objective. The byproduct is, of course, cleaned, sanitized, and records with lower surface noise. The two aren't separable.
Yeah, that's perfect. And on that note, that's where we will end. But Steve, Really, seriously, thank you for being, on the show today. And like I said, to everybody watching, I'll have the links in the description. And we are going to have Steve back because we're not done talking about this. I do want to really pick Steve's brain and get his insight into cavitation, the different processes, some of the things that he's found are beneficial. So there's more to come. But I really wanted to have Steve on to share my experience with the service, and also to get Steve's perspective and to introduce Steve to everybody who's watching. So Steve, thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Rick. Thanks for sharing your channel and your audience with me. And yes, absolutely. If there's follow-up questions, please make mention in the chat feature. And I do try and monitor specific questions. I can't always respond to them, but based on your questions, that could make good future content for conversations between Rick and I. And I really look forward to when that time comes.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.
Now, I hope that you enjoyed this interview as much as I did doing it and participating in it. And, if you found value in this episode, please like and subscribe, especially hit that like button because it does help the show and gets it in front of other folks who might be looking for information and tips about vinyl. And if you haven't signed up for the newsletter, you can do that on the website, joyofvinyl.com. But as always, thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, enjoy yourself, enjoy your records, take care of yourself, and I'll see you soon. Bye.